Hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother. My name's Arthur. Thank you for joining me as we turn to Proverbs chapter 1, and we're looking at verse 8 and 9. At the beginning of his writing to seek to give us wisdom on which to build our lives, having given us a general introduction as to what he's talking about, the wisdom that we might be able to make right decisions in all the circumstances of life and understand the complex issues of life. And then saying the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. He then lays the fundamental platform on which wisdom is based, and that is to take heed to our parents. We read verses 8 and 9. My son, hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother, for they will be graceful ornaments on your head and chains about your neck. And may the Lord bless these words to us. So this follows on from the foundation, which is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. To recognise that God is there and that we are accountable to God is the first step. But where do we get the instruction that we are to use to live our lives? And the first place we get that instruction from is from our parents. God has given parents the responsibility of instructing their children, particularly the father to instruct, and equally the mother to lay down the law. So my son, hear the instruction of your father, as a father seeks to explain to his children the matters of life and why this and why that, and do not forsake the law of your mother. Mothers who give boundaries to their children, that the children are to honour and respect. This is the beginning place for wisdom, for instruction, for learning about life. And if we take heed to these things and do not forsake them, then we're told they will be graceful ornaments on your head and chains about your neck. In other words, people will find a beauty in you because you have taken heed to the instruction that you were given as a child and you've not turned away from it in adulthood. And the principles that you learned from your mother, you have pursued. Now, it's not just Solomon who has this idea. When we go back to the 10 Commandments, for example, in Exodus chapter 20, we find that the 6th commandment says, Honour your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. It is a fundamental issue, along with thou shalt not murder, and thou shalt not commit adultery, and thou shalt not steal, is to give honour to your father and your mother. These two people are both to be honoured, not to be set one against the other, not to both be set aside at some later time because of convenience. And this is addressed not just to children, but to adults. So honour your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. In other words, if you want a long and successful life, this is the precondition, honouring your father and your mother. Of course, the premise of this is that your father and mother have also known and walked in the ways of the Lord. And if a person becomes a Christian and their parents are not Christians, there may be some issues where the parents have not taught the child in the ways of the Lord. But even that does not allow a person to set aside this principle, because Jesus enunciates it in the New Testament, and it is fundamental to the instruction that's given to Christians as well as to the Jewish people. For the Jewish people, they were a God-fearing nation, and so each generation was to learn the ways of God from the previous generation. And if someone was to turn away from that, it would turn the nation away from God, and so the people would be turned out of the land. And this, of course, is what happened historically, for the people turned their hearts away from honouring their mother and father and from walking in the ways of God, and so they were expelled from the land. The days that they spent in the land were from 1500 BC to 600 BC, 900 years. So that's quite a long period of time. But they've been 2,500 years exiled from the land because they did not put this commandment fully into practice, honouring your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Well, when we come to the New Testament, we find Jesus picks up on this commandment in his discussion with the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 15. The scribes and Pharisees, who were from Jerusalem, came to Jesus saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." The Jewish people have a ritual of washing their hands before they eat. And it's not just a matter of making sure the hands are clean, but it is performing a particular ritual in doing that. So the emphasis was on the ritual rather than just on cleanliness. And Jesus answers them and said, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, Honour your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, Whatever profit you may have received from me has been dedicated to the temple, is released from honouring his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, These people draw near to me with their mouth, and honour me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." Now, we can fall into the same trap as that today, of course, because we can have good ideas, but they are not what is taught in the Word of God. We teach them as doctrines, but they are the commandments of men, not the commandments of God. And you can no doubt rationalise them on one basis or another, but when it boils down to it, the thing that is taught is not what God states. Now, in their example, they picked up on this commandment that God had, honour your father and your mother. There's a similar commandment, he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. So that also from Exodus 21:17. So it's clear from the law that parents were to be honoured. But the tradition, the custom that had been introduced, says we have to get a way around that. We have to make it so a man can disobey his mother and father. And the way he does that is that he just commits the obligation he had to his parents to God. Well, actually to the temple. Then they say the temple is more important than mother or father, so that if you give it to the temple, you don't have to give it to your mother and father. But it is better to obey than to sacrifice. And so the way to honour God is to do what God says, not to come and say, well, we have actually a better scheme, we have a hierarchy here, and it is better to give something to the temple, it is better to give something to church in our own situation than it is to give to our mother and father. But the commandment was to honour mother and father. And so it is not better to take what should be given to parents and give it even to the church. Because by so doing, you are taking the tradition of men and setting it above the commandment of God. So that's a religious action, and the scriptures, Isaiah condemns it, because it is pretending to love God when you don't have the heart of God. You're not having the thinking of God, because you're putting the commandments of men above the commandments of God, the thinking of men above the thinking of God. So we go back to our proverb, and it says, "Hear the instruction of your father. Do not forsake the law of your mother." It's not just for children, it's the pattern for living our lives. And if we put the instruction of our mother and father, that's the foundation of wisdom, that we learn as children, and do not depart from it as we grow older, but remain honest and true and obedient, then our character will be such that it will be as graceful ornaments on our head and as chains on our neck. People will see the good character that we have, and they will be pleased with what they see. So, the first place you learn wisdom and instruction is from your parents.